What if I told you that handing every single citizen in a developing economy like $1,000 tax cut today might not increase consumer spending by a single dollar tomorrow?
Yeah, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right? I mean, you'd think people would just go out and spend it.
Exactly. But today, we're basically dismantling the illusion of fiscal stimulus. We're looking at a landscape where those classic, comforting Keynesian multipliers they completely break down.
Right, where handing out money can sometimes just trigger this massive, silent wave of precautionary savings.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Now, I know exactly who is listening right now. You are an economics scholar, and you're likely deep in your prep for the IES General Economics GE-03 Paper 3 exam.
Yeah, at the DSE or JNU Masters level, right? You don't need us to sit here and define what a public good is.
No, absolutely not. And you definitely don't need us to write out the basic national income identity. You are staring down a really formidable syllabus, and you're looking to extract the most rigorously tested mechanics without, all the introductory fluff.
Because the exam you're preparing for, it's notorious for testing the absolute theoretical limits of these models.
Yeah.
The examiners aren't looking for textbook summaries.
Right.
They want to see your ability to break the models down, manipulate the variables, and prove exactly under what empirical conditions they just fail.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the reality of what you're actually going to face. Look at the 2025 IES question on Ricardian equivalence, or look at the analytical problem on the tie-bout model.
Yeah, those are brutal if you just memorize definitions.
Exactly. The recurring nightmare for candidates isn't forgetting the definition. It's failing to articulate the explicit mathematical or, behavioral frictions that cause these elegant theories to collapse in developing economies.
And our mission today is to master the theoretical pillars of public finance. So public expenditure, public debt, and fiscal federalism.
Right, focusing entirely on the underlying mechanics, the empirical evidence, and the structural critiques.
And really, the connective tissue linking all of this is the behavioral response of the economic agent, whether the state expands its budget or issues sovereign bonds to cover a deficit or gives taxation power to a local municipality.
The resulting equilibrium depends entirely on whether the private sector decides to crowd in, crowd out, sort themselves geographically, or just hoard cash. We have to treat the state and the citizen as players in a dynamic game.
Exactly. A dynamic sequential game.
Yeah.
So we really have to start by analyzing the state's opening move, which is expanding its own footprint.
Right. Before we debate how the government finances its massive operations, we have to look at the structural forces driving that expenditure upward in the first place. I mean, we all know Richard Musgrave's tripartite framework, right?
Sure. Allocation, distribution, and stabilization.
Yeah. But what always strikes me is the inherent, almost mathematical tension between these three functions. They aren't just like separate folders on a bureaucrat's desk. They actively interfere with each other.
Oh, absolutely. That interference is where the most complex policy dilemmas come from. Take the conflict between allocation and distribution, for example.
Okay.
The allocation function is designed to achieve Pareto efficiency, right? Correcting market failures, providing public goods up to the point where the sum of marginal rates of substitution equals the marginal rate of transformation.
Right. It's a pure efficiency calculus.
Exactly. But the distribution function operates on a social welfare calculus.
Right. Because if you implement a highly progressive tax regime to achieve optimal distribution, you introduce these massive distortionary effects into the labor market.
Right. You alter the relative price of leisure and labor.
Exactly. Which directly sabotages the efficiency goals of the allocation function.
Or consider the collision between stabilization and allocation. Let's say the economy enters a severe recession, right?
Okay.
And the central government needs to execute its stabilization function through a massive fiscal stimulus. To inject aggregate demand quickly, they might fund highly inefficient projects. The classic digging holes and filling them up Keynesian trope.
Right. So the stabilization goal is met, people have jobs.
But the allocation function is completely corrupted because capital is being directed towards suboptimal, low-return activities instead of genuine public goods.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the broader historical puzzle here, because even with these internal conflicts, the aggregate size of the state, measured as a percentage of GDP, it just relentlessly expands over time.
Right, Wagner's law.
Exactly. Adolf Wagner in the late 19th century essentially framed the government not as a static provider, but almost as a luxury good.
Yeah, the law of increasing state activity, it posits a very specific macroeconomic relationship.
Yeah.
The income elasticity of demand for public goods is strictly greater than unity.
Right. So as a nation industrializes and per capita GDP rises, the state's share of the total economy has to grow disproportionately. I always think of it as like macroeconomic lifestyle creep.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, because when your personal salary doubles, you don't just buy twice as much flour and water, you upgrade your lifestyle. You buy higher tier services, better insurance, premium healthcare.
There.
Wagner is arguing that a developing society does the exact same thing in the aggregate.
Exactly. And he identified 3 specific vectors for this. First, the administrative and protective vector. When you transition from an agrarian economy to a complex, urbanized industrial economy, it creates immense legal friction.
You suddenly need sophisticated property rights enforcement, antitrust regulators, complex legal frameworks.
Right, the overhead cost of maintaining social cohesion just scales nonlinearly.
And then there's the cultural and welfare vector, which is where that income elasticity really kicks in.
Education, public health care, old age pensions, these function as superior goods. As the population escapes subsistence, their political demands shift toward human capital development.
And the third vector is natural monopolies, right? Technological scale.
Yeah, industrialization requires power grids, telecommunication networks. The capital requirements are so vast that early private markets just can't price or absorb the risk. The state has to step in.
But, I mean, we have to look critically at the empirical evidence here, because testing Wagner's law isn't just plotting 2 lines on a graph. To prove it, you have to establish a cointegrating relationship between real per capita GDP and the share of government expenditure.
And the data is highly heterogeneous.
Because his theory assumes income growth inherently causes expenditure growth, right?
Yes, and that is the central Keynesian critique. Wagner assumes the causality runs exclusively from national income to state expenditure. But Keynesian models, especially endogenous growth theory, argue the exact reverse.
But the expenditure causes the growth.
Right. Strategic public expenditure is the engine that drives up national income. Granger causality tests often show bidirectional feedback, blurring Wagner's clean mechanism. Plus, Wagner completely ignores the supply side of government financing.
The political constraint on taxation, he treats the state's ability to raise revenue as if it's infinitely elastic.
Which brings us to the British economists Alan Peacock and Jack Wiseman. They looked at UK data from 1890 to 1955 and realized Wagner's smooth curve was an illusion. In reality, expenditure growth looks like a staircase.
The Peacock-Wiseman displacement effect. This is such a brilliant integration of political economy and psychology. They argued that normally government expenditure is tethered by what they called the public's tax tolerance.
Right. Politicians know that breaching that accepted tax threshold is just electoral suicide.
Exactly. But this equilibrium gets shattered by exogenous shocks. A world war, a catastrophic depression, or, a pandemic. The crisis forces the state to require an immediate, massive influx of capital.
And crucially, the public's psychological resistance to taxation temporarily collapses.
Right. The crisis provides the political cover to just smash through that historical ceiling of tax tolerance.
But the true genius of Peacock-Wiseman isn't just that spending spikes. It's their explanation for why it never returns to the pre-crisis baseline after the crisis ends. They called this the inspection effect.
The permanent structural break.
Exactly. During the crisis mobilization, the state apparatus is forced to deeply inspect the socio-economic fabric of the nation. They uncover glaring inadequacies. Maybe the public health infrastructure is failing, or education is inadequate.
And once the crisis passes, they don't lower taxes back to the old baseline.
No, because the public is already habituated to the higher tax rates. The state captures that revenue stream and reallocates it to address those newly discovered social deficits. The UK income tax is the textbook example. It ratcheted up for the world wars and never went back down.
So if the budget is caught in this upward ratchet, the critical question for an emerging economy shifts from how much to what kind. The quality of public expenditure debate. We have to separate revenue expenditure from capital expenditure.
Right. Revenue expenditure is consumptive. Salaries, subsidies, interest payments. It doesn't create physical assets. Its long-term growth multiplier is incredibly weak, sometimes even negative if funded by distortionary taxes.
While capital expenditure is the engine, gross fixed capital formation highways, ports, digital corridors.
Think about it through a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE, model. When the state builds a freight corridor, it reduces logistics costs for private firms.
Right. It increases the marginal product of private capital. The private sector becomes more profitable just because the public infrastructure exists.
Precisely. This is crowding in. The empirical literature shows the fiscal multiplier for capital expenditure in developing economies is significantly greater than unity, often between 1.5 and 2.5, while revenue expenditure struggles to hit 1.0.
But here's the unavoidable friction. Governments are forced to spend more, and capital expenditure is great for growth, but they hit a wall, taxes. You can only tax people so much before you trigger capital flight. So if they can't tax, they borrow.
They issue sovereign debt.
Which drops us right into public debt and deficit financing. Let's start with internal versus external debt, because the macroeconomic consequences are wildly different.
Completely different. Internal debt is owed to domestic agents, citizens, domestic banks. Servicing it is essentially a closed-loop, redistributive exercise. The state taxes citizens to pay interest to domestic bondholders.
So it's an internal transfer of purchasing power. The aggregate wealth of the nation doesn't actually shrink.
It doesn't shrink, though it can be highly regressive if wealthy bondholders are paid by middle-class taxes. But the real resources stay inside the country. External debt, however, is a different animal.
Because you step outside the loop, you're borrowing from foreign sovereigns or multilateral institutions, usually in a foreign currency like the US dollar.
Right, the original sin hypothesis. When a developing nation services external debt, it must physically transfer real economic value abroad. It has to run trade surpluses, exporting real goods instead of consuming them domestically. It drains real resources.
And it exposes the entire balance sheet to exchange rate volatility. If your currency depreciates, the cost of that dollar-denominated debt explodes overnight. That's exactly what triggered the Asian financial crisis.
Exactly. So, recognizing these risks, we have to look at how economists view deficit financing. For a long time, the dominant paradigm was sound finance.
The classical view: budgets should always be balanced, treating the sovereign like a household.
Right. Any deviation was seen as moral decay. Debt was inherently bad because it absorbed private savings. The only exception was borrowing for self-liquidating assets, like a toll bridge that pays for itself.
But then the Great Depression happened. Deflation, massive unemployment, and the classical models failed completely.
Because of sticky wages and a collapse in aggregate demand. This brought the Keynesian Revolution, and specifically, Abel Lerner's theory of functional finance.
Right. Lerner argued that a household can't print its own currency. Judging a state by household standards is a category error.
He proposed that the sole purpose of fiscal policy is to steer the macroeconomy toward full employment without hyperinflation. If private demand is weak, the state has a functional mandate to run a deficit.
The debt is just an instrument. In functional finance, a balanced budget with 20% unemployment is a catastrophic failure.
Exactly.
It sounds great, but wait. If the government borrows internally for the stimulus, isn't it drawing from the same finite pool of domestic resources? This is the crowding out hypothesis. Why does government borrowing sometimes stifle the private sector?
You must explicitly master the two mechanisms here. First, the loanable funds channel. Imagine the domestic financial system as an auction house for capital.
Okay, an auction house.
The supply is private savings. Normally, private firms bid for this capital to build factories. The clearing price is the market interest rate.
And private investment is elastic. If the rate jumps from 4% to 7%, suddenly a lot of private projects aren't viable anymore.
Right. Now, the government enters this auction house to fund a massive deficit. They are a behemoth, and they are price insensitive. They issue billions in bonds, drastically increasing the demand for loanable funds.
And because short-term savings are inelastic, this new demand shock pushes the interest rate up.
The government gets its money, but the higher interest rate prices keep private firms out of the market. The fiscal stimulus is statistically offset by the collapse in private investment. The state crowds out the private entrepreneur.
We can visualize this with the ISLM model. Expansionary fiscal policy shifts the IS curve right. If the money supply is fixed, we move along the LM curve. Income rises, but interest rates spike dramatically.
That's the loanable funds channel, but the pain doesn't end there. We also have the asset substitution channel, which operates on the portfolio balance of investors.
Right, the wealth effect. An institutional investor holds corporate equities and bonds.
But when the government runs a deficit, it floods the market with sovereign bonds. These have a zero risk waiting for default.
They're the ultimate safe asset.
So as the supply increases, their price drops and yield goes up. The investors seize this attractive risk-free rate, and what do?
They rebalance. They liquidate their corporate debt and equity to buy the government bonds.
Exactly. This drains liquidity directly from private capital markets. The cost of equity for firms rises. Again, the sovereign deficit starves the private sector.
And this domestic tug-of-war spills over internationally. We have to link crowding out to the global equilibrium. The twin deficits hypothesis. The fiscal deficit is chained to the current account deficit.
Let's trace the algebraic logic for the listener.
Okay, let's do the math.
The total output of an open economy is y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. National income equals consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports.
But
Now, how is that income allocated? It's either consumed, saved, or paid in taxes. So y equals c plus s plus t,
so if we set those equal, the consumption, the C, just cancels out.
leaving us with s plus t equals I plus g plus x minus m. Now, we rearrange to isolate the balances. We get s minus I equals g minus t plus x minus m.
This is huge. The gap between private savings and investment equals the fiscal deficit plus the trade balance.
Let's isolate the external sector. If we look at deficits, the current account deficit, or M minus X, must identically equal the fiscal deficit, G minus T, minus the net private savings gap, S minus I.
The mechanism is irrefutable. If the government runs a massive fiscal deficit and private savings aren't enough to cover both domestic investment and the deficit,
The math dictates the shortfall must be financed by importing capital from the rest of the world.
and how do you absorb foreign savings? You run a current account deficit. You import more than you export.
Right. The higher domestic interest rates attract foreign capital, the currency appreciates, exports collapse, and imports surge. The fiscal deficit and current account deficit are inextricably linked twins.
So the chain reaction is terrifying. Government borrows, interest rates spike, private investment is crowded out, foreign capital flows in, currency appreciates, and exports are hollowed out.
It's a severe indictment of deficit financing. But what if this entire chain reaction is based on a fundamental miscalculation of human rationality?
Oh, man. This brings us to Robert Barrow and Ricardian Equivalence.
Okay.
We just spent 20 minutes on the secondary effects of borrowing. And Barrow steps in and mathematically proves that under certain conditions, the choice between tax financing and debt financing is completely irrelevant.
Yes. And to master this for the exam, you have to state the mechanism explicitly.
Okay, give it to us.
Ricardian Equivalence says it does not matter whether the government finances a given level of spending through taxes today or through borrowing today and taxes tomorrow. Rational households see through the veil of public debt. They know the borrowing means higher future taxes, so they save exactly the amount of the tax cut to pay those future taxes. The extra saving neutralizes the fiscal stimulus completely.
Let's construct the intertemporal framework. The government hands every citizen $1,000 today funded by debt.
The traditional Keynesian view says disposable income rises, people spend $800 of it, aggregate demand shifts, multiplier effect kicks in.
But Barrow says households don't look at current cash flow. They look at their lifetime wealth, the present discounted value of their wealth.
Right. The government has an intertemporal budget constraint. If they cut taxes today by $1,000, they have to borrow it.
And they have to repay it with interest in period 2.
So future taxes must increase by exactly $1,000 multiplied by 1 plus the interest rate. When the hyper-rational household solves its Euler equation for optimal consumption smoothing, they substitute the government's constraint into their own.
And the timing of the taxation mathematically drops out. The present discounted value of their lifetime tax liability is completely unchanged. The state hasn't given them a gift, they've given them a deferred liability.
Exactly. So to maintain a smooth consumption path, the household takes the $1,000 tax cut and saves 100% of it. They invest it. And when the future tax hike hits, they use that exact savings account to pay the bill.
Which means private consumption doesn't increase by a single dollar today.
Private savings rise by the exact magnitude that public savings fall. Aggregate savings are unchanged, aggregate demand is unchanged, so there's no pressure on interest rates, no crowding out. The multiplier is 0.
Okay, the logic is airtight on a chalkboard. But here's where it gets really interesting, because as a human being, it feels absurd. I mean, people don't live forever. Most people can't even predict their grocery bill next month. Why would I alter my consumption today for a tax liability that falls on a generation that hasn't even been born yet?
And that intuition is exactly how you dismantle the theory on the exam. Barrow's proof requires extremely restrictive conditions. You need to list them meticulously. First, infinite horizons.
Right, because of the finite lives problem.
Yes, borrow assumed overlapping generations with perfect intergenerational altruism. You care about your children's utility exactly as much as your own. So you save the tax cut and leave a meticulously calculated bequest to your heirs to cover their future taxes. The family is basically an immortal economic agent.
That is a wild assumption about human foresight. What's the second condition?
Perfect capital markets. Individuals must be able to borrow and lend at the exact same risk-free interest rate as the sovereign government.
Ignoring credit scores entirely.
Third, lump sum taxes. The future taxes must be non-distortionary lump sum taxes, independent of income or wealth.
Because income taxes would alter behavior.
And fourth, no liquidity constraints. Every actor can perfectly smooth consumption by accessing credit seamlessly.
Okay, so we need immortal altruists, frictionless banks, mythical lump sum taxes, and no one ever gets denied a credit card. It's begging to be torn apart. If I'm sitting for the IES exam, how do I explicitly structure the failures of Ricardian equivalence in developing economies?
You break down those four assumptions. Failure mechanism 1, severe credit constraints.
The hand-to-mouth consumer.
Right. In developing economies, financial intermediation is highly imperfect. People have a high marginal utility of current consumption, but can't borrow.
So if you give them a tax cut, their marginal propensity to consume is practically 1.0. They need to buy food today. They spend it immediately, and the stimulus works. Equivalence collapses.
Failure mechanism 2, finite lives and imperfect altruism. People discount future tax liabilities at a rate higher than the market interest rate because of the probability of death.
They figure there's a good chance they won't be around when the bill comes due, so they perceive an increase in net wealth and spend it.
Failure mechanism 3, the reality of distortionary taxes. Real-world taxes are income or consumption taxes. If people know future income taxes will rise, it reduces the after-tax return on future labor.
The relative price of leisure drops.
So they substitute toward leisure in the future, which shrinks the labor supply and lowers output. Debt financing changes the real equilibrium. It's not neutral.
And failure mechanism 4, uncertainty.
Right. Future tax incidence is highly uncertain. Will it be a wealth tax? Inflation. Because they can't calculate their exact share, they can't perfectly offset it.
So Ricardian equivalence is really a diagnostic tool. By seeing why it fails, we identify frictions like credit constraints in the real economy.
Exactly. It shows us why the multiplier is never quite as robust as the simple Keynesian cross suggests, because some fraction of the population will engage in Ricardian saving.
Okay, we've spent all this time on the state as a monolith, but the central government doesn't patch local potholes. This brings us to fiscal federalism. Which level of government should do what?
Back to Musgrave. He formulated the assignment of functions based on the geographic mobility of capital and labor.
Let's test that. Why must stabilization belong to the center? Why can't a city run its own macroeconomic stimulus?
Because local economies are hyper-open. If a municipality deficit spends to cure unemployment, the workers take their wages and buy cars from another state or electronics from abroad.
The marginal propensity to import is too high. The stimulus leaks out, but the local debt stays local. The city goes bankrupt, subsidizing the neighboring state.
Which is why stabilization needs a closed national economy. What about distribution? Can a local government aggressively tax billionaires to fund local welfare?
No, because that triggers welfare migration. The wealthy face punitive taxes and just move to the next town over. Capital flight.
And low-income individuals migrate in for the welfare. The revenue base shrinks, the expenditure explodes, it's a race to the bottom. Redistribution has to be centralized, where physical borders prevent easy immigration.
Which leaves allocation of public goods to the local governments.
Yes, due to preference heterogeneity. A national government providing a uniform package creates deadweight loss.
Right, a rural community doesn't want the same level of park funding as a dense city.
Local politicians have the informational advantage to tailor the public goods to local demand.
Which naturally leads us to the Tybalt model, Charles Tybalt in 1956, the solution to the free rider problem, voting with your feet.
He conceptualized local jurisdictions as competitive firms. Each municipality offers a specific package of public goods funded by a specific tax rate.
It's literally like choosing a streaming service. You pick the specific bundle of content public goods that you are willing to pay as subscription taxes for.
Exactly. You survey the towns, evaluate your utility, and physically relocate to the one that matches your preferences.
If I want great schools, I move to Town A and willingly pay the high property tax.
Through this spatial sorting, the free rider problem is solved. The local provision of public goods becomes Pareto efficient, just like a private market.
It's brilliant, but the conditions are insane. Perfect mobility, zero moving costs, perfect information about every town's tax package, no interjurisdictional spillovers. So Town B can't just drive over and use Town A's library.
And you need a massive continuum of jurisdictions. It assumes a frictionless universe.
So practically, Wallace Oates gave us the decentralization theorem to figure out the optimal size of a jurisdiction.
Right, it's a trade-off.
Yep.
Larger jurisdictions have economies of scale. It's cheaper per capita to build one giant water plant than 50 small ones.
But smaller jurisdictions better satisfy preference heterogeneity. The sweet spot is where the marginal savings from scale perfectly offset the marginal welfare loss of ignoring local preferences.
But this entire architecture faces a crushing reality: vertical fiscal imbalance. The center has the lucrative elastic revenue streams like income and corporate taxes.
But the local governments have the heavy expenditure mandates: schools, roads, healthcare.
The center has the money, the states have the mandates. So we rely on grants and aid. And the economic design of these grants dictates local behavior. We need to distinguish between matching grants and lump sum grants.
Let's do matching grants first. Conditional.
The center says, for every dollar you spend on education, we match it.
So it halves the relative price of education for the local town?
This creates an income effect, but crucially a substitution effect.
Mm-hmm.
Education is artificially cheaper, so the local government substitutes spending away from other things and toward education. It corrects positive externalities.
Now, a lump sum grant, unconditional. The center just wires $10 million to the town.
It's a parallel shift of the budget constraint. No change in relative prices, pure income effect. Standard theory says this is identical to giving the local citizens an aggregate income increase of $10 million.
And since citizens have a low marginal propensity to consume public goods, they'd want, say, $1 million spent on parks, and the remaining $9 million returned as a tax cut.
The grant should substitute for local taxation, but empirically.
It never happened.
The flypaper effect.
Yeah.
Money sticks where it lands. An unconditional grant expands the local budget way more than an equivalent increase in private income would.
The local bureaucrats intercept it. They build a new headquarters instead of cutting taxes. Why?
Principal agent problem. Bureaucrats are utility maximizers. They want bigger budgets and more power. And there's massive fiscal illusion.
The voters are rationally ignorant. They don't know the sender sent the money, so they don't demand the tax cut.
Exactly. The money sticks to the government sector.
Wow. Okay, we've gone from macro aggregates to debt calculus to local grant manipulation. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, sitting for the 2026 IES exam?
You need to master 3 patterns. Pattern 1, Ricardian Equivalence. State the conditions, derive the intuition, and explicitly argue the 3 reasons it fails in developing contexts: credit constraints, finite lives, distortionary taxes.
Pattern 2, crowding out. Explain both the loanable funds auction house channel and the asset substitution portfolio channel and evaluate their empirical relevance.
And pattern 3, the tie-out model. Master the assumptions and explain why voting with your feet fails in developing countries where poverty constrains mobility and information is imperfect.
That's your blueprint. But before we go, I want to leave you with a philosophical paradox to ponder. Think about the flypaper effect. We just proved that money sticks where it lands because local politicians are self-interested and voters suffer from fiscal illusion. They're ignorant and myopic. But earlier, in Ricardian Equivalence, the model assumes those exact same citizens are hyper-rational, infinitely forward-looking calculating machines who perfectly analyze sovereign balance sheets across generations.
It's completely contradictory.
Exactly. If the flypaper effect proves citizens can't even detect a local $10 million transfer, how can macroeconomics rely on models assuming they can calculate the present discounted value of 50-year sovereign bonds? Are we modeling robots or are we modeling humans?
It's the ultimate boundary where pure math hits messy reality. A great thought to carry into the exam.
We hope this deep dive has armed you with the analytical rigor you need. Thank you for joining us, and best of luck on your exam.